You're mid-sermon. You just finished a point, and your brain goes completely blank. What's next? What's next? What's next? That frantic scramble, most pastors try to solve it by memorizing harder, write a full manuscript, cram it into your brain, or at least memorize your outline, right? But that's not the answer. The real secret to preaching without notes has nothing to do with memorization and everything to do with how you write your sermon in the first place. I'm Danny Strange, and I help pastors write sermons using story structure. In my last video, I shared the storytelling skeleton I learned from a Pixar storyboard artist, a framework that exists underneath every great story. If you haven't seen that one, I'll link it in my description. And today, I want to show you how that skeleton becomes a mental map, one you can follow on a Sunday morning without looking down at a single note. Now, here's what I've discovered. Stories are easy to remember. And not because we try to memorize them, but because every story follows the same structure. There's a beginning that set things up. There's something that kicks off the journey. There's tension that builds, a breakthrough moment, and then resolution. You don't have to memorize a story you live through, you just know it, because a story has shape. But most sermons don't have that shape. They're a collection of points, facts, observations, and that's really hard to hold in your head. Now think about someone you know who's a bad storyteller. They start telling you about something, and halfway through you're thinking, where is this story going? They add random details that don't matter. They backtrack. At the end, they don't even remember why they started telling you this story in the first place. I feel like a lot of sermons feel like that. Not because the content is bad, but because there's no structure underneath the sermon holding it together. And if there's no structure, good luck trying to deliver it without notes. But when a sermon has the right structure, the same structure underneath any good story, something shifts. You stop trying to recall information, and you start following a path. Now, let me show you what I mean. When I was 16 years old, I was driving down the freeway with some friends, coming home from a movie on a Friday night. As I was nearing my exit, a Ford Mustang comes flying onto the on-ramp at high speed and merges right into my lane, almost hits me. So I jerk the wheel to the left to try to get out of his way, and the vehicle starts spinning. I remember that time just stopped in that moment. We were all sitting in the car screaming, not like scary screaming, but like a comedic movie scream, something out of a film that we'd seen. And I cranked the wheel out to the right, overcorrecting, and I start spinning the other way, 180 degrees, and I stop facing oncoming traffic. Headlights are coming at me, closer, closer. I'm turning the key, the car won't start, I'm panicking. And then I realized I'm driving a stick shift. So I drop the clutch, put it in neutral, start the car, first gear, pull off the freeway. I got off the freeway, checked everyone's fine, car's fine. It was bonkers. And ever since that day, every time I take that exit, I check my blind spot like my life depends on it. Now here's the thing. I've never written that story down, never tried to memorize it. But I can tell it to you again right now and have the same beats every time. Why? And because that story, like every great story, follows a structure. There's an Act 1, a setup. I'm 16 years old, driving down the freeway. There's Act 2, where there's building. The Mustang pulls into me. I start spinning, try to solve it myself. Act 3, a breakthrough. I'm stopped in the middle of the freeway. Cars are coming at me. I finally get the car started and pull it off. Act 4, resolution. I'm gasping for breath on the side of the road, and now I've chosen to drive differently. Every story follows the same structure. Setup, building, breakthrough, resolution. You don't have to memorize a story you've lived through because the structure carries you. One moment leads to the next. The tension builds, it peaks, it resolves. You just simply follow the path. Now here's what clicked for me. If every story is easy to remember because every story follows the same structure, then if I could just get my sermon to follow that same structure, it would be just as easy to remember. And that's what story form preaching is. You're not memorizing harder. You're building a story armature into every sermon, a skeleton underneath that carries you from beginning to middle to end. And when you do that, you can internalize a 35-minute sermon as easily as you can internalize a story about spinning out on the freeway. The structure becomes your map. And if you know the map, you'll never get lost. So let me show you what this looks like in an actual sermon. I want to show you two layers. The first layer of the sermon is what your audience sees, the sermon itself, the content, the teaching, the stories, the application. The second layer is what's underneath, the armature, the skeleton, the structure that holds everything together. When you know the structure, you always know where you are. Even if you forget a specific line, you know the function of the moment you're in, and that's what keeps you from getting lost. So let me walk you through a real sermon so you can see both layers in real time. I recently preached a sermon on Acts chapter 2, verses 42 through 47. And that's the passage about the early church and how they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, breaking of bread and prayer. So let me show you how the 4 acts worked in that sermon. Act 1 was the setup, my introduction. I opened with a story about a man who told me he'd been attending our church for 8 years and never talked to anyone. Then I compared it to kids who thought downtown Disney was actually Disneyland. They didn't know there was something bigger on the other side of the gates. By the end of Act 1, the audience knows the journey we're on. What does it look like to actually experience real community instead of just attending the church? So then I move into Act 2, the main body of my sermon, and I start building. I walk them through the text. They devoted themselves. I taught what devotion looks like, and it's beautiful. But I also built some tension. I told a story about a life group my wife and I almost quit 2 weeks in. We weren't allowed to switch, so we had to figure it out. By the end of Act 2, they're leaning in. They're tracking with the teaching. They're starting to want what the text is describing. And that brings us to Act 3, the second half of the main body of the sermon, breakthrough. I revisited the 8-year guy, and I asked the harder question. How many of us are living the same pattern? I named the real reasons people don't step in, and then I landed on Acts 2:39. The promise is for you. That's the breakthrough, the moment where the tension peaks and the text breaks through. It meets them right where they are. Finally, Act 4, the conclusion is my resolution. I brought back the Disneyland story. The moment the woman opened the gate and just stood there, silent, an invitation. I gave them 3 clear steps and closed by reframing our phrase, welcome home. By the end of Act 4, they know what to do, and they've been sent. Here's what I want you to see. When I stood up to preach that sermon, I wasn't trying to remember every word. I just knew I'm in Act 1, I'm setting up the journey. I'm in Act 2, I'm building. I'm in Act 3, I'm pressing towards the breakthrough. I'm in Act 4, I'm resolving it and sending them out. The setup, building, breakthrough, resolution. The same structure as the car accident story. The same structure as every story you've ever told. 4 acts, 4 functions, that's the map. Build your sermon like a story, and you'll never feel lost again. I go way deeper into how to build sermons this way in my free training. It's called How to Get Unstuck in Your Sermon Preparation. I'll walk you through the whole methodology, how to find the story in your text, how to structure your sermon around these 4 acts, and how to internalize it so you can preach without notes. The link's in the description, or just go to storyform.church, storyform.church. If this was helpful, here's what I'd ask you to do. First, go grab that free training. It'll take you deeper than I can go in a YouTube video. But second, if you haven't seen my video on what a Pixar storyboard artist taught me about sermon writing, go watch that one next. That's where I unpack the story skeleton that makes all of this work. I'll link that right here as well. Until next time, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.